Okay, here's a thought to start us off. What if the most powerful way to tackle those really persistent problems in, say, your city, or maybe your workplace, or even just your neighborhood? What if it wasn't the usual stuff? Meetings, policy papers. What if it was something else entirely? Something maybe unseen, but incredibly dynamic. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a concept from our source material called strategic intercession. We're basically unpacking a framework that presents prayer, not just as a personal thing, but as this a potentially potent force for like large-scale systemic change. Our mission, really, in this deep dive is to explore the core ideas, where this framework suggests they come from, the principles, the practical approaches it talks about. We want to help you understand what it might mean to actually view prayer and maybe use prayer as a kind of strategic advantage for transforming cultures and systems around you.
And it really is a significant shift in perspective, it's suggesting. I mean, the material frames prayer as actively partnering with what it calls a divine blueprint, engaging with an unseen realm. It's a way of thinking about change that pretty fundamentally flips the script on how we usually approach things, focusing only on what we can see and measure.
All right, let's jump right in then. This framework kicks off with a really compelling question, doesn't it? What if prayer isn't something that gets in the way of practical action? Or, just a hopeful little side note to your main efforts. But what if it's the actual engine that drives breakthrough?
Exactly, yeah. It pushes back hard against relying solely on what it calls incremental improvements.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we can fix deep problems just with better data or smarter strategies or organizational tweaks alone. It suggests we might be missing what it identifies as potentially the most potent catalyst for change, which it defines as intentional spirit-led intercession.
So, okay, it's saying the challenges you see could be political gridlock, ethical messes in business, struggles in your community. They aren't just logistical problems.
Right, not just things for spreadsheets and meetings.
It's suggesting you see them as, deep problems, but also as invitations, maybe, to partner with this God's blueprint idea.
Mm-hmm. And the analogy it uses is pretty powerful. Stop treating prayer like the last resort, or some sidebar activity.
Yeah.
And start thinking about it, integrating it as your genuine strategic advantage.
Wow, moving it from the edge to the absolute center.
Yeah, right to the core of how you tackle complexity.
Okay, that is a big reframe. So where does this framework say this whole idea comes from? It talks about rooting it in a divine architecture found throughout the Bible.
Yes, exactly. It points to biblical narratives.
Like Adam naming the animals in Genesis. It suggests that wasn't just labeling.
Right. It frames it as exercising a kind of partnership authority with the creator over creation, a delegated authority.
Or Moses in Exodus 32, interceding so passionately that it actually changes the planned outcome.
The idea that prayer, in that context, can realign heaven's decrees. That's the language it uses.
And it highlights core components it sees in this divine system, things like authority, covenant, and decree.
Yeah, the idea that the universe isn't indifferent, but it's a responsive kingdom.
A place where words spoken in alignment with this architecture actually have, weight, creative potential.
That's the concept. And it gets deeper when the material unpacks the biblical foundation further. It talks about the covenant code.
Uh-huh.
So biblical intercession isn't just random asking. It's anchored in God's specific covenant relationships and promises, like Abraham, David.
Okay.
Those promises become the legal basis, the solid ground for strategic prayer. It also brings in this concept of heavenly courts, drawing on visions from Daniel 7 and 8, Revelation 4 and 5.
Well, those are complex passages.
Yeah, and it interprets them as revealing this kind of cosmic courtroom setting where there are spiritual principalities, princes operating over nations. So strategic intercession, in this view, is like lodging a legal petition in those courts, engaging in a spiritual legal process almost.
Interesting. And it connects this to spiritual warfare, too.
Definitely. It references Ephesians 6.1, the rulers.powers.world forces of this darkness. So intercession isn't passive. It's actively engaging those described forces. It's positioned as the lance that pierces these forces, aiming to liberate areas held captive.
Okay, so that's the underlying framework, the architecture. What does this actually mean for someone wanting to engage in this? The material outlines principles for the strategic intercessor. First one is insight before influence. What does that actually involve?
Well, it involves a couple of things. One is what it calls terrain mapping.
Like a general surveying a battlefield?
Sort of, yeah, but for the spiritual topography. Discerning the history of a place or system, its patterns of sin, bondage, maybe even times of past divine visitation. understanding the unseen landscape,
And the other part.
seeking the light of revelation.
Mm,
This is about gaining understanding through Scripture, yes, but also potentially through prophetic insight and deepening intimacy with God to expose those hidden strongholds or dynamics.
got it. Insight first. Then the second principle is covenantal alignment.
hmm And this is key. It's not just general praying. The material really stresses grounding your intercession in specific scriptural covenants and God's promises. So you might take Joel 2.25, I will restore the years the locusts have eaten, and use that specific promise as the anchor, the legal foundation, for your prayers about a specific damaged situation or community.
Okay, being specific with the scripture.
Exactly. And this also includes something called corporate identification.
Which means,
It's about identifying with a community or a city or even a sphere like government or business. Sometimes this involves repenting for what the material calls corporate sins that have shaped that landscape and praying to see that place or sphere reclaimed based on the covenant relationship with God. Then the third principle focuses on decrees and declarations.
so the power of speaking.
Very much so. This framework puts a high value on spoken words. It echoes verses like Job 22.28 about decreeing a thing. It suggests strategic intercessors learn to make authoritative proclamations, speaking God's revealed will into specific situations.
And the belief is that this actually shifts things.
Yeah, the idea is it can shift the legislative realms of heaven and earth. Words aren't just, sounds. They're seen as arrows, powerful agents aligning earth with heaven's mandates.
Okay, foundation principles. Now, this is where it gets really practical and honestly quite fascinating. The framework introduces actual tools. First one, spiritual mapping.
Yes. And this is all about seeing beyond the surface, right? Charting that unseen realm tied to a place or system. But the material is careful to say this is not about sensationalism, not a witch hunt.
Okay, important distinction.
Right. It's framed as holy curiosity, partnering with the Spirit to discern both the areas of spiritual opposition and where God is already working or has made specific promises.
Are there biblical examples given for this?
It draws parallels.
Mm.
Like Joshua and the Israelites circling Jericho, that's seen as a form of spatial engagement, reconnaissance almost, or Nehemiah's night survey of Jerusalem's ruined walls.
Mapping the damage before rebuilding.
Exactly. Mapping the breakdown before planning the restoration.
So what dimensions might you map according to this?
It outlines a few key areas. Historical trauma, looking for generational wounds, broken covenants in a place's past, maybe referencing passages like Jeremiah 6 or Ezekiel 37. Then idolatry and false beliefs, identifying dominant cultural norms, ideologies, even things like materialism or secularism that function like idols, drawing lines back to Exodus 32 but applying it now. Also, gateways of darkness, trying to pinpoint specific locations, maybe institutions, or even recurring events where opposition seems particularly concentrated. It might reference things like 1 Samuel 5 or Acts 12. Wow, that's detailed. Is it only focused on the negative? No, absolutely not. Crucially, it says mapping must also involve actively overlaying God's covenant promises onto that same map, using relevant scriptures, Joel 2.25 again, Isaiah 61, Psalm 103, Isaiah 40 as a grid of hope. These promises are seen as the legal warrant for prayer and change.
And how do you do this mapping? What are the tools?
It suggests a mix, doing your research, historical, social data, engaging in prayer walking, which we'll get to, and dedicated times of prophetic discernment, listening together for insights.
Okay, that description of mapping leads perfectly into the next tool, prayer walking. Sounds like taking that insight and, well, walking it out.
That's essentially it. The framework calls it embodied intercession.
Embodied.
Yeah, bringing your prayers into physical reality by literally moving through the streets, the buildings, the spaces you're praying for.
So it's a kind of territorial engagement.
Bringing prayer and prophetic declaration right onto the ground, challenging spiritual forces as it sees it on their own turf.
Any biblical precedents mentioned here?
Again, yes. It points to Jesus walking through Galilee, ministering as he went. Joshua's circuit around Jericho, obviously. Even Isaiah's symbolic acts, like walking naked, are seen as a form of embodied prophetic intercession.
What are the core principles of doing this effectively according to the source?
It highlights bringing the presence of God into a space, making prophetic declarations, speaking truth over places, sometimes simple practical acts like prayerfully sprinkling water or laying hands on a building. And importantly, engagement, letting the prayer walk lead to actually connecting with people, building relational bridges.
Okay, mapping, walking. Then the third tool sounds quite profound, receiving blueprints from heaven and turning them into strategic planning.
Yeah, this is a big one. The idea of a divine blueprint isn't just, your own good idea that you bless. It's presented as God revealing his specific sovereign design for a situation, a place, a sphere, and inviting partnership to bring it about.
So it's less about asking for stuff and more about receiving revelation.
Exactly. Receiving revelation about outcomes, timing, specific strategies needed. It references John 16:13, where Jesus says the Spirit will guide into all truth and declare things to come. Key principles here are seeking discerned direction, not just guessing. Understanding it's a collaborative partnership, your plans refined by God's vision. Realizing it often involves iterative revelation.
Yeah.
It unfolds in stages, you don't get it all at once. And trusting in resource alignment that God will bring the people, the money, the timing needed.
And then you actually make a plan.
Yes, turn the vision into action. Structure it like you might any project. Initialization, mobilization, execution, review. And crucially, building in celebratory markers to acknowledge progress.
So setting clear goals, short-term, mid-term, long-term.
And using both quantitative measures like how many people get involved, how many partnerships form, and qualitative ones, testimonies, observable shifts in culture to see how things are progressing.
Right. This clearly isn't presented as just personal prayer or even just for churches. The source calls it leaven that permeates society. Where does it suggest applying this approach?
It gets specific about several key spheres. First, government. It views government as a divine institution, referencing Romans 13.
Yep.
So intercession here becomes a form of spiritual advocacy for righteous leadership, just policies.
Examples.
It points to Daniel praying for Babylon, Joseph stewarding in Egypt, Paul's instruction in 1 Timothy to pray for kings and authorities. So praying for leaders' wisdom, integrity, praying for policies reflecting justice and mercy, even praying for the governmental structures themselves. It suggests using specific scriptures like Proverbs 2 for wisdom for policymakers or Psalm 91 for protection over, say, schools.
Interesting. What's next?
Economics and business. It frames the marketplace as a mission field, sees business as sacred ground. It brings up the Hebrew concept of avoda, where work, worship, service are all integrated. Wealth is seen as stewardship, referencing Deuteronomy 8.88, meant to bless communities.
Any biblical figures highlighted?
Lydia from Acts 16. A successful businesswoman whose home and business became a ministry hub. She's seen as a kind of gatekeeper of spiritual impact. So prayer here focuses on integrity, community blessing, praying for divine open doors, citing Revelation 3.8.
Okay, government, business. What else?
Media and arts. This is called the pulpit of culture, shaping imagination and narratives. God's presented as the original artist, Genesis 1. Figures like Bezalel and Aholiab in Exodus filled with the Spirit to create. Jesus is the master storyteller with parables.
And the importance.
Media is seen as a powerful discipling force. The material suggests negative forces often try to manipulate it, so strategic prayer is needed for creators, vision, courage, resources, for content, truth, beauty, hope, and for gatekeepers, publishers, executives.
Makes sense. What about closer to home?
Family and neighborhoods. Called the first frontier of societal transformation. Homes are sacred spaces, citing Lydia's household again, the Philippian jailers. The idea is God works generationally, relationally. Neighborhoods are God's incubators for community, where love your neighbor from Mark 12 applies directly.
So praying for.
Family altars, Joshua 24.15, marital renewal, safety, Psalm 91, spiritual openness in the community, John 4. It even mentions the practical idea of adopt a home, specifically praying for your neighbors.
And finally, it touches on global application.
Yes. Cross-cultural applications and global movements. Acknowledging the kingdom is global, Revelation 7.9, it stresses strategic intercession must be contextualized. One spirit, many expressions. Honoring cultural uniqueness like Jesus did with the Samaritan woman or Roman centurions.
So adapting the practices.
Exactly. Maybe silent prayer walks are more appropriate somewhere. Maybe virtual mapping for dispersed teams. Using culturally resonant art or music in prayer. It gives examples like the 247 prayer movement, adapting prayer rooms globally. YWAM using spiritual mapping in places like Bangkok or Kolkata. African prayer movements fasting over national issues.
And the key is partnership.
Absolutely. Partnership with local believers. Avoid parachute praying, just dropping in without connection.
Okay, transforming whole spheres like this. Clearly not a solo mission, as the source points out. It talks about building and sustaining things together.
That's right. It goes into team building and resource mobilization. Acknowledging God's big designs usually need more than one person. So gathering spirit-aligned partners with different gifts, strategists, intercessors, prophets, administrators,
Building a team culture.
prayer check-ins, shared learning, mutual care, aligning gifts to tasks, equipping people, and for resources, it encourages anticipating needs, venues, materials, texts, but trusting God for provision. It references Nehemiah using letters of request. Stewardship and generosity are key.
And this isn't a quick fix, right? It talks about persistence.
Definitely. Persistent intersection.
Yeah.
This isn't a one-time event. It points to long-term biblical examples. Moses praying for decades, Nehemiah for months, Daniel's 21 days, Jesus praying all night.
So how do you maintain momentum?
Spiritual self-care is vital. Having an adaptive strategy, things change. And, importantly, celebrating the victories along the way to keep hope alive. Practical suggestions include daily anchor times for prayer, prayer triggers linked to routines, journals, partner networks, setting prayer milestones, and weaving prayer into leadership meetings before planning, after action, even Sabbath pauses.
So bringing this all together, for you listening right now, maybe thinking about a tough situation at work or something in your neighborhood or maybe a bigger societal issue, what does this deep dive suggest?
Well, I think at its core, it suggests a really fundamental shift. Moving from maybe a more passive approach to prayer to one of active partnership with this idea of a divine design. And shifting from seeing problems only through the lens of, what's visible and physical, to actively trying to discern and engage the unseen dynamics that the source material talks about.
And it's meant to be relevant, applicable.
Yeah, the whole point seems to be that this framework is presented as applicable to the spheres and challenges you care about. It offers a potential pathway for change that might look different from conventional methods alone. Starting points suggested could be simple. Try a prayer walk in a specific area you care about. Begin prayerfully mapping the dynamics of a sphere you're involved in. Or identify specific scriptural promises to anchor your prayers for a situation.
And that really brings us to the close of this deep dive. We've explored this concept of strategic intercession as it's laid out in our source material. We looked at its proposed biblical roots in that divine architecture, outlined the core principles it suggests, dug into tools like spiritual mapping and prayer walking, and saw how this framework applies this kind of focused prayer across different areas of society.
It's really that idea of prayer as less of a simple plea and more of a dynamic partnership, isn't it? Working with a blueprint to actually participate in reshaping reality.
Yeah, actively shaping, not just reacting. So the final thought to leave you with, based on this material, if strategic intercession is about partnering with God's revealed design to transform systems and cultures, where in your own life, your own community, might God be inviting you to move beyond just being concerned about something, to maybe step onto pathways of potential freedom through prayer? What specific area, what challenge might you feel prompted to begin prayerfully mapping and contending for change within this framework? Something to reflect on, using the concepts we've discussed today from the source material. How might they offer a different lens, maybe even a different pathway forward? We'll end our deep dive there.